3 months ago, my grandmother passed away and left me a little over $90,000. Money she'd quietly saved over decades working as a seamstress out of her own home. Money she specifically wrote into her will was meant for Hannah's future. Whatever that future holds. I need someone outside my family, and outside my fiancé's family, to tell me honestly if I'm the jerk for what happened after. I'm 28, engaged to a man named Aaron, together for 3.5 years, set to get married next fall. We live in a small town called Cedarville, about 30 minutes outside Richmond, close enough to both our families that holidays and weekend dinners happen constantly, which under normal circumstances I actually love. My grandmother, Josephine, was the closest person in my life growing up. My parents worked long shifts when I was a kid, and I spent most afternoons and every summer at her house. She's the one who taught me to open my first savings account, who paid for my college textbooks when money was tight, who always told me that money you didn't earn carelessly should never be spent carelessly either. When she passed, the inheritance wasn't a total surprise. She'd mentioned leaving me something, but the actual amount was more than I expected. I cried reading the will, not because of the money, but because of what she'd written next to my name, a reminder that this was meant to give me options she never had. Aaron and I talked about it together, like we talk about most financial decisions. We agreed most of it would go toward a down payment on a house, some into savings, and a portion set aside for our wedding, which we'd been planning fairly modestly, around $14,000 for everything, small venue, close friends and family. Nothing extravagant. That's when Aaron's mother, Denise, found out about the inheritance. I want to be fair here. Denise has never been outright cruel to me. She's warm in social settings, generous with compliments, the kind of mother-in-law who remembers your coffee order. But she has always had a very clear favorite between her two kids, Aaron and his younger sister Chloe, and it has always, unmistakably, been Chloe. Chloe is 25, recently engaged herself to a man named Trevor who I've met maybe 5 times in 2 years. Chloe has never held a job longer than a year, has changed career paths 3 times since college, and has been financially supported by Denise and her husband in ways that Aaron has quietly resented for years, but never directly confronted. About 2 weeks after my grandmother's funeral, Denise invited me and Aaron over for what she called a family planning dinner. I assumed it was about our wedding, maybe some input on venues or guest lists, something normal. Instead, over dessert, Denise brought up Chloe and Trevor's engagement, mentioned how tight things were for them financially, how Trevor's job had been unstable lately, how Chloe's dream wedding venue, a lakeside estate about an hour away, was going to cost around $32,000, money neither of them had. Then Denise looked directly at me and said, and I remember this almost word for word, that since I'd come into some money recently, and since we were all going to be family soon anyway, maybe it would be a beautiful gesture for me to help contribute toward Chloe's wedding, the way real family looks out for each other. I sat there completely stunned. Aaron looked equally caught off guard, glancing between his mother and me like he genuinely hadn't seen this coming either. I said, as politely as I could manage in the moment, that the inheritance was specifically meant for my own future, that my grandmother had written that intention directly into her will, and that while I cared about Chloe, I wasn't in a position to fund another couple's wedding, especially not one more than twice the size of what Aaron and I were planning for ourselves. Denise's expression shifted immediately. She said she wasn't asking me to cover the whole thing, just a reasonable contribution, maybe 10 or 12,000, framing it like I was being asked for pocket change instead of a large chunk of my entire inheritance. I held my ground, said I wasn't comfortable with that, and the table went quiet in a way that made the rest of dinner feel like sitting through a slow-motion car crash. Chloe, who I later learned had been told about this plan beforehand, texted Aaron that night calling me selfish and not even really family yet, which honestly stung more than I expected it to. Aaron apologized on the drive home, said his mom had overstepped, that he'd talked to her. But he also, almost hesitantly, asked if there was any version where I'd consider even a smaller amount, just to keep the peace going into the wedding season. That question sat with me the entire ride home, and it's still sitting with me now, because it made me wonder exactly how far Aaron expected me to bend a boundary I thought we'd already agreed on together. The days after that dinner were tense in a way Aaron and I hadn't experienced before in our relationship. We'd had disagreements, sure, but nothing that touched something as fundamental as what boundaries we'd actually hold once his family pushed against them. 2 days later, Chloe called me directly, which surprised me since we'd never really had that kind of one-on-one relationship before. She didn't apologize for the text calling me selfish. Instead, she launched straight into an explanation of how hard things had been for her and Trevor, how they'd been saving for over a year, but venue prices kept climbing. How she felt like this could be the one thing that finally made people take her and Trevor seriously as a couple building a future. I listened genuinely, because I do care about her, even if we've never been especially close. But when she finished, I told her the same thing I'd told her mother, that the inheritance was earmarked for my own future with Aaron, and that I wasn't in a position to fund someone else's wedding, no matter how much I understood the pressure she was under. She got quiet, then said something that told me exactly how deep this expectation actually ran in their family. She said, "I just thought since you don't really have anyone else to spend it on, it made sense to help someone who actually needs it. Don't really have anyone else to spend it on." As if my grandmother, who raised me through summers and helped pay for my education, who wrote my name into her will with a message meant only for me, somehow didn't count as someone I was honoring by using that money the way she intended. I didn't say anything cruel back. I just told her I hoped they figured out a venue that worked for their actual budget and ended the call. That weekend, at a family barbecue at Denise's house, the tension became impossible to ignore. Denise was polite to my face, but noticeably cooler than usual. Aaron's father, Gary, who'd stayed mostly neutral the night of the dinner, pulled Aaron aside at one point, and I caught just enough of the conversation to hear him say something about not rocking the boat this close to the wedding. Later that evening, Aaron and I sat in the car before driving home, and he told me his parents had brought up something new, an idea that Chloe and Trevor could get a loan from us instead of a gift. Something we could set up formally so it wouldn't feel like charity, just help between family, to be paid back eventually. I asked Aaron directly if he actually believed that loan would ever get repaid, given everything we both knew about Chloe's job history and spending habits. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting, honestly, that he didn't think it would, not really, but that his family was putting a lot of pressure on him to find some version of yes. That's when I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest since the barbecue started. I asked him whose side he was actually on in this, mine or his family's expectation of what a loan that would probably never get repaid was supposed to look like. He didn't answer right away, which honestly told me more than any answer could have. Aaron's silence in that car stayed with me for days afterward, longer than I think he even realized. We didn't fight about it outright, but something had shifted, a quiet distance that hadn't been there before, the kind where you're both technically fine but carefully avoiding the one topic that actually matters. About a week later, I decided to do something I probably should have done from the very beginning. I called my grandmother's lawyer, the one who'd handled her estate, mostly just to ask a few follow-up questions about the will, but also, if I'm honest, because part of me wanted a clearer, more official record of exactly what my grandmother's intentions had been, something concrete I could point to if this pressure kept building. The lawyer, a calm, older man named Mr. Whitaker, who'd known my grandmother for over 20 years, pulled up the file and read me a section I hadn't fully absorbed the first time, back when I was still too raw with grief to process every legal detail. Beyond the general statement about my future, there was a specific clause my grandmother had added just 8 months before she passed, stating clearly that the inheritance was intended solely for me and any future household I built, and was not to be used to settle family financial disputes or fund extended family obligations. Mr. Whitaker mentioned, gently, that my grandmother had actually called him about a year earlier, specifically to ask how she could make sure this money couldn't easily be pressured out of me by well-meaning relatives, because she'd apparently seen a pattern in our family, watching how easily people gave in to Denise's expectations, and she didn't want that pattern applied to money she'd worked her entire life to save. Sitting there on the phone, learning that my grandmother had specifically anticipated this exact situation, planned for it, protected me from it before it even happened, undid something in me. It wasn't just grief this time. It was a strange, steadying kind of comfort, knowing that even after she was gone, she'd found a way to have my back. I asked Mr. Whitaker if he could send me a formal, plain-language summary of that clause, something I could show Aaron directly if I needed to. He agreed, and had it emailed to me within the hour. That evening, I sat Aaron down and showed him the email. I told him I wasn't trying to make this a legal standoff between us, but that I needed him to understand this wasn't just me being difficult or overly attached to money. My grandmother had specifically protected this inheritance with intention, with legal language, because she'd known, better than any of us apparently did, exactly how this kind of pressure could play out in his family. Aaron read it twice, quiet the entire time. When he finally looked up, he said something that gave me a small amount of hope, that he hadn't realized how deliberate his mother's request actually felt until seeing it laid out against something this clearly intentional. He said he'd talk to his parents again, more firmly this time, and set an actual boundary instead of just deflecting the way he had at the barbecue. I wanted to believe him. Part of me did. But I'd also learned enough about this family dynamic over the past few weeks to know that Denise rarely accepted a boundary the first time it was set. And I had a feeling this conversation with his parents was going to be far harder than Aaron expected it to be. Aaron called his parents the next evening, and he asked me to give him space to have that conversation alone, which I respected, even though every part of me wanted to be in the room for it. He came back an hour later looking more drained than I'd seen him in weeks. He said he told Denise, clearly this time, that the inheritance was off the table entirely. No gift, no loan, nothing, and that he needed her to accept that and stop bringing it up. According to Aaron, Denise didn't take it well. She apparently accused him of letting me control him, said that in her day, family helped family without needing lawyers and formal documents to justify it, and brought up, almost as a threat, that she'd already told several relatives about the wedding venue situation, framing me, before this conversation even happened, as the reason Chloe's dream wedding might fall apart. That detail hit me harder than anything else. Denise hadn't just asked me privately and accepted my answer. She'd apparently been quietly building a narrative among the extended family for weeks, positioning me as the obstacle, before Aaron and I had even fully worked through how to handle this as a couple. 2 days later, I found out exactly how far that narrative had spread. My future sister-in-law, Chloe, posted something on social media, vague enough to claim plausible deniability, but specific enough that anyone who knew our situation would understand exactly who it was about. It said something about how some people inherit money and forget where they came from, and how real family doesn't gatekeep generosity. I didn't respond publicly. I screenshotted it instead, along with the earlier texts from Chloe calling me selfish, and saved everything in a folder, the same instinct my grandmother had apparently had months before I even knew I'd need it. Aaron was furious when he saw the post, more furious than I'd seen him during this entire situation. He called Chloe directly, and from what he told me afterward, it turned into their most heated argument in years, Chloe accusing him of choosing me over his own sister, Aaron telling her, finally and directly, that this had never been about choosing sides, it had been about her and their mother refusing to accept a boundary the first 3 times it was set. That night, Aaron apologized to me properly, not just for his family's behavior, but for his own hesitation weeks earlier, admitting he'd spent too long trying to keep everyone comfortable instead of clearly backing me up from the start. It was the first time since this whole situation began that I felt like we were actually standing on the same side of this, together, instead of me defending a boundary mostly alone. But the peace didn't last long. 3 days later, an invitation arrived in the mail, addressed to both of us, for an engagement party Denise was hosting for Chloe and Trevor at a venue I recognized immediately from earlier conversations as a smaller, cheaper version of the lakeside estate Chloe had originally wanted, the kind of downgrade that made it very clear this family drama wasn't actually over, it had just quietly moved into its next phase. We went to the engagement party anyway. Aaron said skipping it would only give his mother more material to spin the story with, and honestly, after everything that had already happened, I agreed. I'd rather stand in that room and let people see for themselves that nothing about my presence there was hostile than let Denise's version of events be the only one people heard. The party itself started civil enough, forced smiles, careful small talk, the kind of surface-level politeness families use when everyone knows there's tension underneath, but nobody wants to be the one to say it out loud first. It held together until Denise, about an hour in, gathered a small group near the dessert table, loud enough that it clearly wasn't meant to be private, and started talking about how some people in this family had gotten a windfall recently but couldn't find it in their hearts to help family members who were struggling. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. Every single person in that cluster looked directly at me. I felt my face go hot, that specific kind of humiliation where you're being talked about in the third person while standing right there, unable to fully defend yourself without escalating things further in a room full of half-strangers. What happened next surprised even me. Aaron's father, Gary, who had stayed carefully neutral through this entire situation, set down his drink, walked over to that cluster, and said, calmly but firmly enough that the whole group heard it, that he was tired of watching his wife turn a private financial disagreement into a public spectacle at his own daughter's engagement party, and that if anyone deserved credit for generosity in this family, it was Hannah's grandmother. A woman none of them had even met, who worked her entire life to leave something behind for the one person she trusted to use it wisely. The dessert table went dead silent. Denise's face flushed red, somewhere between embarrassment and fury. She started to respond, but Gary, still calm, added one more thing, that this conversation was over, tonight and permanently, and that if she brought up the inheritance one more time, in any setting, he'd start seriously questioning what exactly she thought this marriage was owed from a woman who wasn't even part of their family yet. I hadn't expected Gary, of all people, to be the one to finally draw that line, especially not this publicly. Aaron squeezed my hand under the table the rest of the night, and for the first time since this entire situation started, I actually felt supported by more than just him. Chloe, to her credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable by how far her mother had taken things, and later that night, she found me near the coat check, alone, and quietly apologized, not for asking originally. She still didn't seem to fully see the problem with that part, but for the social media post, admitting it had been petty and that she regretted posting it once she saw how much it had actually escalated things between Aaron and their mother. It wasn't a full resolution. Denise left the party early, visibly upset, and didn't speak to me directly again that night. But something had shifted, publicly and undeniably, and for the first time since my grandmother's funeral, I drove home feeling like the truth of the situation had finally been said out loud, by someone other than me. For almost 2 weeks after the engagement party, things went quiet, the uncomfortable kind of quiet where you're not sure if a situation has actually resolved or is just gathering itself for another round. Denise didn't call. She didn't text. Aaron said she'd been distant with him too, short responses, skipped their usual Sunday phone call, which apparently was unusual enough on its own that even Aaron seemed unsettled by it, despite everything that had happened. Then, out of nowhere, Denise called me directly, not Aaron, me, which hadn't happened once through this entire situation. I almost didn't answer, but something told me it was better to hear whatever this was rather than let it build into something even more distorted through second-hand family retellings. Her tone was different than I expected, quieter, less performative than the version of her I'd seen at the dinner table and the engagement party. She said she'd been thinking a lot since Gary's comments, that hearing him say those things publicly, especially in front of people outside the family, had actually made her stop and reconsider how she'd been handling this whole situation. Her tone was different than I expected, quieter, less performative than the version of her I'd seen at the dinner table and the engagement party. She said she'd been thinking a lot since Gary's comments, that hearing him say those things publicly, especially in front of people outside the family, had actually made her stop and reconsider how she'd been handling this whole situation. She didn't fully apologize, not in the clean, direct way I might have hoped for. But she did say something that felt like real movement, that she recognized she'd put pressure on me that wasn't fair, especially so soon after losing someone I clearly loved deeply. And that she'd been so focused on Chloe's stress about the wedding that she hadn't stopped to think about what it actually meant to ask a grieving granddaughter to hand over money meant specifically for her. I told her I appreciated her saying that, and I meant it, even if it wasn't the full acknowledgement I'd hoped for regarding the social media post or the comments at the party. I told her I genuinely did want a good relationship with her, especially with the wedding coming up, but that it had to be built on her actually respecting decisions Aaron and I made together. Not just tolerating them until the next financial pressure point came along. She agreed, said she wanted that too, and the call ended on the calmest note anything between us had landed on in over a month. 2 days later, Chloe reached out again, this time with a plan instead of an apology. She said she and Trevor had sat down and looked at their actual finances honestly, without factoring in any outside help, and decided to scale their wedding down significantly, a smaller venue closer to home, a guest list cut almost in half, something they could genuinely afford without leaning on anyone else. She asked, almost shyly, if I'd be willing to help her find good deals on decorations and catering, using connections from when Aaron and I had been planning our own wedding, not money, just advice and contacts. I said yes immediately, relieved to finally be offered a version of help that didn't come with strings attached to my grandmother's inheritance. For the first time in over a month, sitting in my kitchen that evening telling Aaron how the calls had gone, it felt like this situation might actually be heading somewhere resolvable, instead of just being managed week to week. Over the next month, things settled into something closer to normal, or at least a new normal, one where boundaries actually held instead of quietly dissolving under pressure. Chloe and Trevor's smaller wedding planning genuinely seemed to relieve some tension in the whole family. I spent a few Saturday afternoons with Chloe going through vendor lists, helping her negotiate a better catering deal using a contact from my own wedding planning, and somewhere in those afternoons, something I hadn't expected started happening. We actually started becoming closer, not the fake, forced closeness of family obligation, but something real, built on her finally seeing me as an individual person instead of a solution to her financial stress. She admitted to me, during one of those planning sessions, that she'd always felt a specific kind of pressure being Denise's favorite, an unspoken expectation that things would simply work out for her because her mother would always find a way to make them work out. And that somewhere along the way, she'd stopped learning how to solve problems without that safety net. Watching her and Trevor figure out their wedding on their own terms, she said, was honestly the first time in years she'd felt proud of something she'd built herself instead of something handed to her. Denise, for her part, kept her word about not bringing up the inheritance again. She was noticeably more careful around me at family gatherings, less performative, occasionally even asking my opinion on things the way you'd ask someone you actually respected, instead of someone you were managing. Aaron and I used that month to fully finalize our own wedding plans, funded partly by the inheritance exactly the way my grandmother intended, a down payment on a small house we'd already started house hunting for, and enough left over that. For the first time in either of our adult lives, we weren't entering marriage with financial stress hanging over us. About 3 weeks before Chloe's now much smaller engagement dinner redo, Gary pulled me aside quietly at a family lunch, away from everyone else. He told me he wanted to apologize, not just for that day at the party, but for staying silent through the earlier parts of this entire situation, letting Denise's expectations go unchecked for longer than he should have. He said watching me hold my ground, calmly and consistently, without ever once being cruel about it, even when his wife and daughter weren't always kind to me in return, had actually made him think harder about patterns in his own marriage he'd let go unaddressed for years, ways he'd quietly enabled Denise's favoritism toward Chloe instead of stepping in earlier. I told him I appreciated that more than he probably realized, and that whatever came next for our family, I was genuinely grateful he'd finally spoken up when it mattered. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at our house, addressed to me specifically, from Mr. Whitaker's office. Inside was a short handwritten note my grandmother had apparently left with him, to be delivered not immediately after her passing, but only if a certain condition was ever met. One Mr. Whitaker's cover letter explained had been triggered by a form I'd unknowingly signed months earlier confirming the inheritance clause had been formally invoked in a family dispute. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The letter was short, just half a page in my grandmother's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting, the same handwriting from decades of birthday cards and grocery lists left on her kitchen counter. She wrote that if I was reading this, it meant someone had tried to pressure me out of the inheritance, exactly the thing she'd feared when she added that clause with Mr. Whitaker. She said she wasn't angry at whoever had tried. Families put pressure on each other in all kinds of ways, sometimes out of love twisted sideways into entitlement, sometimes out of old patterns nobody ever bothered to question. What she wanted me to know, she wrote, was that she hadn't left me that money to make my life easier in some small, temporary way. She'd left it so that I would learn, early in my adult life, exactly how firmly I could hold a boundary when something truly mattered, because that skill, she wrote, would matter far more over the course of my life than the money itself ever would. She said she hoped, whatever the dispute had been, that I'd handled it with the same quiet steadiness she'd always seen in me as a kid, the girl who saved her allowance instead of spending it the moment she got it, who thought things through instead of reacting. And she said if the person who'd pressured me was someone I loved, she hoped, in time, there could be understanding on both sides, but never at the cost of me abandoning what I knew was right. I sat on our kitchen floor and cried reading that letter in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the week of her funeral, not out of sadness this time, but out of something closer to being deeply, completely understood by someone who saw this entire situation coming before I even knew to expect it. It's been 4 months since that letter arrived. Aaron and I are 3 weeks out from our wedding now, small, exactly the way we planned it, funded honestly, without a single dollar of tension attached to it. The down payment on our house closed last month, a modest place about 15 minutes from Cedarville, close enough to family, far enough to have our own space to build something entirely ours. Chloe and Trevor got married 2 months ago, a beautiful, small ceremony that cost a fraction of what she'd originally wanted, and honestly, from what everyone who attended said, felt far more personal and joyful than the Lakeside Estate version ever would have. She's become, unexpectedly, one of the people I talk to most in Aaron's family now, something I never would have predicted the night of that first dinner. Denise and I are still rebuilding, slower than the rest, but rebuilding honestly. She's stopped performing generosity as a transaction and started, in small ways, actually listening when I speak, asking questions instead of assuming, which for her, I've learned, is its own kind of real growth. Gary and I have a closer relationship now than I ever expected to have with a future father-in-law, built on that one moment he chose to finally speak up when it counted, and every conversation since. Looking back on everything, I don't regret holding that boundary for a single second, even through the parts that were genuinely painful, the social media post, the whispered comments at the dessert table. The weeks of tension with Aaron before he fully found his footing beside me instead of trying to keep everyone comfortable. My grandmother knew, better than any of us, exactly what kind of test this inheritance would become, and she made sure that even after she was gone, I wouldn't have to face it without her voice somewhere in my corner. So here's what I actually want to know from all of you. If your future mother-in-law asked you to fund your sister-in-law's wedding using money specifically left to you by a family member who'd passed, would you have held the line the way I did, or would you have found some middle ground to keep the peace? Let me know honestly in the comments below.